ready. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Okay.
The library has returned.
Yeah. Okay. 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 Actually, Cassie, if you run up here real quick first. Okay. There we go. I wanted to make sure the camera is centered on you when you're speaking.
Oh, okay.
That's good. Okay.
And it sounds like, well, and should we turn this mic
Yes, because remember
that way?
now,
Right, because it's that mic and that mic.
right. Yep, there and there. So
Okay, great.
okay. Ready for me to start, Marty?
You can go.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all here. Most of you know me already. I'm Dr. Mark Bembo, retired history professor from Marymount. Yay! And the museum director for the Arlington Historical Society. So I used to have two roles here. Now I'm mostly the Historical Society, but it's nice to see you all here, and thank you for those coming online. A couple Historical Society things. First, two events coming up. One is our regular every month on the second Thursday event here. But before then, we have a special event on Saturday, October 28th at 11 a.m. That's the memorializing the enslaved at the Ball Sellers House. If you're not aware, that is a project that has been going on trying to identify the names of those who were enslaved in the county. Which is difficult research. The census reports didn't say, who the names were. So a lot of research and tracking down to find them. Quite a few have been identified so far, and they're going to be putting plaques called stumbling stones, although they're not literally going to be in the sidewalk for you to trip over. But it's based on how they have recognized Holocaust victims in Germany. So the first of the plaques is going to be going up at the Ball Sellers House, which is one of the two museums run by the Arlington Historical Society. So it's going to be naming the three individuals that we know of that were enslaved on that property by the Carlin family. So that's October 28th at 11 a.m. Free and open to the public. And then on Thursday, November 9th, here in Reich Auditorium, 7 p.m., Operation Sky Shield. Now, after 9/11, they grounded all the airlines, all the flights in North America, US and Canada, and said, oh, it's the first time that's ever happened. Well, a researcher from the Smithsonian found out, oh, wait, no, it's not. In the early 60s, there were several Cold War drills where they grounded the flights over the US and Canada and prepare a drill in case of a Soviet aerial attack. So our speaker is going to be talking about that. Roger Mola, who's here today, is a researcher from the Smithsonian and a writer, and he's found all sorts of great information about it. I mean, I studied the Cold War when I was working on my doctorate. That was our main thing we studied. Of course, it's 1980s. We are in the Cold War then. I'd never heard of it. And this is something we all studied. So it's really great that he found all this information about it. Now, our speaker tonight, I'm really happy to have here, Dr. Cassandra Good, my colleague here in the history department. I did post-Civil War. She did up through the Civil War. We had all of U.S. history covered between us. She's a historian, writer, and teacher. She earned her doctorate from the University in Pennsylvania and got her bachelor's and master's from George Washington. She has worked for the Smithsonian in art museums, was associate editor of the papers of James Monroe at the University of Mary Washington. Her work has been supported by various institutions, including Mount Vernon, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. She's associate professor of American history here at Marymount, and she was one of the advisors on the Memorializing the Enslaved project. Her latest book is on George Washington Parke Custis, but more than that, it's about all of that larger extended family of George Washington, his heirs, and how they memorialized Washington and their part in the early United States. So, and she will be signing books afterwards. And we do request that if you go to have one of her books signed, that you wear a mask while you're over at the book table. We have plenty over there. They're free. Don't worry. Take one, take two, whatever. But yeah, go ahead and help yourself. But we're really, she said just one. Okay. Yeah, you have to buy the book. Yeah, if you take a mask, you've committed to buying a book. So I'm really pleased. Working with Cassie for a long time, we were always talking about what our book projects was. So I've been waiting for this book to come out for quite a while. I've already got it. My wife, Annette, listened to it on audio. It's great. So I think we're going to have a really good talk tonight. We do ask that you save your questions for the end. So Cassie, Dr. Good, they're all yours.
Thank you, Mark, for the welcome. It's really fun to get to speak at my home institution and two people who probably already know a little bit about the people that I'm talking about tonight, which is a rarity because most people have never heard of the Custises. And what I thought I'd do tonight is, rather than sort of summarize the book for you, tell you a little bit about why the Custises. Why would I write a book on the Custises, whom most people outside of Arlington and Alexandria have not heard of? And what is it that makes them important, worth talking about? And then also give you a sort of flavor of what the main characters in the book are like, because they really are characters. So how did I come to write about this family? It actually started when I was working on my dissertation, which became my first book, Founding Friendships, about friendships between men and women. And I came across these three people here: Bushrod Washington, Eliza Parke Custis, and Nellie Custis. All of them had friends of the opposite sex. And for all the friendships that I was writing about, I was researching who these people were. And with all three of these people, I was like, wait, there's another generation of George Washington's family. I've never heard about them. I knew he didn't have kids, but I really had never thought about, any sort of heirs, descendants, the next generation. And I started to wonder, this was a man who was treated almost like a king while he was president, and then, a sort of quasi-god of America's civil religion after his death. So what would that mean for the next generation of his family? And that was sort of the question I started with. And when people said to me, well, if he didn't have any direct descendants and you're writing about Washington's descendants, who are you writing about? And my answer to that over a decade ago when I started this project was, I don't know. I'm going to have to find out. And it started with just trying to figure out the family tree. So it's fairly easy to get a family tree for George Washington's ancestry. This is just a tree from online. Now, you will see the complication here of the fact that he has a lot of siblings. He had 2 half siblings and 4 full siblings that survived. They all have kids. So that's a pretty big family of siblings and nieces and nephews. You notice that most of these siblings, if not all, I think all predecease him. The Washingtons are not a long-lived family. But so if I was just looking at this family tree, that still doesn't tell me who the next generation is. So I also spent some time looking at George Washington himself and what did he say about his family and who he thought his family was. I have a quote here from a draft of his first inaugural address, where he says, "I have no child for whom I could wish to make a provision, no family to build in greatness upon my country's ruins." Well, that's kind of strange. Everybody has family. But what he means is he did not have a blood-related child, more particularly a son. And this is actually part of what made Americans feel more comfortable with him being the first president, which I think is why he was thinking about including this line, although he didn't ultimately, in the first inaugural. But he also says this in a private letter at one point, that he has no child. And so there's that very narrow sort of blood-related conception of family. But then if you look, there's also tons of young people at Mount Vernon over the years. And so I tried to get a handle on who all of those people were. This is a very ugly version that I put together almost 10 years ago when I was trying to figure out who all these people were. I had this page and the next page printed out on the wall in my office in Mount Vernon. And there were people at Mount Vernon who would come into the office to look at it because there just aren't family trees of the following generations. Mount Vernon's historian, Mary Thompson, has actually done a really detailed genealogy, but it's not depicted visually like this. Like I have a printout of it from her that's very, very thick. But to try and depict it visually was something else. And the only other visual I could get, there was sort of a keeper of the Washington genealogy who sent me in the mail a 6-foot-long family tree that went nearly up to the present. But nobody on the left side of this screen was on it because these are all Custises. They are not blood related to George Washington. They come through Martha's family. Now, you'll notice they do cross over here because Nelly Custis married George Washington's nephew, Lawrence Lewis. And in fact, when she did that, Washington said, basically, "I'm glad she's marrying into my family." Even though he had raised her as his daughter, it was marrying a blood relation of his that really brought her into his family. So I think this sort of is a hint to get us thinking about the degree to which blood relations, or now we might talk about DNA, play into defining who is our family. So you're seeing one of his siblings, Betty Lewis, she was at Kenmore in Fredericksburg, and then Samuel here with their kids. Harriet, for instance, lived at Mount Vernon for a while. Then we have some of the half siblings, other siblings here. You'll notice a lot of repeating names. This also makes it very difficult. Sometimes there are 2 people with the same name in the same generation. So we have Bushrod Washington, who didn't have any kids, but he had 2 nephews, both named Bushrod Washington, which makes life very difficult when you're trying to understand who these people are. So I was going through all of their records, trying to find these nieces and nephews' papers. And first of all, there were not a lot of them to start with. These people either didn't have a ton of correspondence or it was not saved. I think in the case of Bushrod Washington, whose papers, there is an edited edition, new one out now. I think most of his personal letters were destroyed. His wife's letters don't survive. So I suspect that their correspondence was burned, which was common practice at the time. So what is left is mostly his legal correspondence and some fun stuff from when he's younger, which is what I had come across on my first project. He turned out to be much less interesting as he got older. And, I was just reading about the legal cases, but he never talks about George Washington other than when he's dealing with executing the will. And in fact, when Bushrod dies, his obituary does not mention that he was related to George Washington. So that actually is what I came to see was the case with all of the nieces and nephews. They were basically Northern Virginia planters who, had the last name Washington, but they weren't particularly engaged with Washington's legacy. They weren't talking about it. And I had thought, okay, at least the people that live in Mount Vernon are going to be talking about this and seeing themselves as the next generation. And I just want to show this sort of complicated chain of ownership for Mount Vernon, because the fact that George even ended up with Mount Vernon was a fluke of multiple people dying young. His half-brother Lawrence was the original owner of the property. When he died, it went to his daughter Sarah. She died young. It went to the widow Anne, who initially rented it to George. Then Anne also died prematurely. And that is how George Washington ended up inheriting Mount Vernon. So it was a sort of unusual series of events. Martha had it very briefly after his death. And then it went to Bushrod, who I should note is the oldest son of George's oldest full brother. So by some English inheritance law, it makes a lot of sense. He's also the most successful of the nephews. Bushrod didn't have kids, so it goes to his nephew, who dies within 3 years of inheriting it. It goes to the widow. And then the last owner is John Augustine Washington III, who also dies fairly young at the very beginning of the Civil War while on a scouting mission for Robert E. Lee. So I thought, okay, at least this Bushrod through John Augustine III line might have some discussion about what it meant to be George Washington's family. And what I discovered was that is not what they were talking about. And just to show you, Mount Vernon, I think, recently acquired this image. This shows Jane Charlotte Washington, who was one of the owners. The tallest boy there is her son, John Augustine Washington III. And so painted by John Gadsby Chapman, which they have a pretty good collection of Chapmans at Mount Vernon. So as it turned out, the people who cared about being Washingtons didn't have the last name Washington at all. They were the Custises. So just a refresher, many of you are probably familiar with who that is, but here we have Martha Dandridge Custis and her husband, Daniel Park Custis. He was a very, very wealthy man who owned major estates, hundreds of enslaved people. They had 4 children together, 2 of whom survived. And then Daniel also died fairly young. So in 1759, Martha, as one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia, marries George Washington, bringing with her use rights to a lot of that land and enslaved people, as well as 2 children who are 6 and 4 years old. I find this a slightly creepy portrait of the children. I don't know what it is about Wollaston. I'm not a Wollaston expert, but I wouldn't necessarily want this as the portrait of my children. But this is Jackie or John and Patsy or Martha Custis, again, painted in 1757. And so they are young children when they come to Mount Vernon with Martha Washington. And George Washington is their stepfather. They didn't necessarily use that term. They actually often would have used the term father-in-law at that point. George was somewhat involved in their upbringing. When they were younger, less so. It was common practice for the mother to be more involved in the upbringing than the father. George gets more involved when it comes to Jackie's education as he gets older. And some of you may have seen some of the letters between George and Jackie when he's trying to get Jackie to finish school, not to drop out of school and get married young, which he is unable to stop from happening. Jackie does leave school. He manages to drop out of, I think, 2 different colleges and get married to Eleanor Calvert. And this is what brings us to the main characters of our story today, the children of Jackie and Eleanor. They had 7 children in very quick succession, 4 of whom survived. And you see them here, if you sort of go from the top left, the eldest, Eliza, Elizabeth, just again to make things confusing, went by Betsy until she got married and then started going by Eliza. I will call her Eliza for simplicity's sake here. Then on the right, Martha or Patty. Then on the bottom left, Nelly. And finally, George Washington Parke Custis, or Wash. And they're all born between 1776 and 1781. So this, of course, is when George Washington is off fighting the Revolution. In 1781, when Wash is 6 months old, Jackie decides to go down to Yorktown to try and join the fight. He gets camp fever and passes away. So this leaves his wife, who's in her mid-20s, with 4 young children. Now, on the one hand, we would say that sounds very challenging to be a widow with 4 young children. We should also keep in mind that she has a lot of enslaved people to help her. So it is not that she is helpless here, but it was common practice at this time for another member of the family, especially if they were wealthy, to take in some children from somebody in this kind of situation. So people often say, why only take 2 of the kids? Eleanor didn't want to really part with any of them. I think the reason she agreed for the younger 2 to go is that they were living nearby. Eleanor was living at this point in Abingdon, where the National Airport is now. And then the kids were going to be in Mount Vernon. So she knew she'd be able to see them frequently. And the kids had some of the same tutors and dance masters. They were seeing each other. So George and Martha take in the younger 2 children. They do not legally adopt them because you couldn't at that point. But they are often referred to as the Washingtons' adopted children. And here we see Nelly and Wash as the 2 children in this famous Edward Savage family portrait. And this portrait is taken over a series of years, as you can see on the dates, during the presidency. And this image is part of what made Nelly and Wash celebrities. It was not just that they're in this one portrait. This portrait was painted with the intention of creating prints. And these prints were very popular. They were in many people's homes for decades up through the Civil War. There's a really interesting article by Scott Casper that actually traces the changes in the prints of this, where at certain points, the enslaved person in the background is removed. And for certain audiences, North versus South. At one point in the image, the kids are even removed and it's just George and Martha. But it mostly stays this core 4 people here in the family. They generally stay in this. And that means that plenty of people have images of Nelly and Wash in their homes. They are famous from childhood. So they have that, they don't have the last name, but everybody knows who Wash and Nelly Custis are. And Nelly was also part of the entertainment that happened at the president's house. She was a very gifted harpsichord player, and she often was asked to play music for guests. She was also a pretty good artist, and she would be asked to show her drawings to adults who were visiting. So she was really sort of publicly out there, well-known, and famous enough that by the end of the presidency, there was actually a wax figure of her in a museum. So it was George, Martha, and Nelly. She was that famous. Now, there's a little bit more effort that goes into it for the 2 older sisters, obviously, who are left out of this image. They have not been adopted. They're not living in the nation's capital as part of the first family. They do come and visit for a time, but they had to work a little bit harder. They also had some tools, as we'll see, at their disposal. And those tools are largely in the form of relics. And I'm not talking about saints' relics, but sort of relics of George Washington, relics in America's civil religion. The Custises end up with almost all of the nice objects from Mount Vernon. You might think, okay, Bushrod Washington inherited Mount Vernon. That means he gets the stuff. However, Martha, by the terms of her will, she had inherited all the contents of the house, but from George's will. And in her will, she said everything in the house should be sold and the money would go to pay for her nephew's education. So the Custises were the ones sort of running things at this sale. Nelly and Wash were still living in Mount Vernon at the point that Martha died in 1802. Nelly is married and has a child at this point, but they're still living in the house. And supposedly when Bushrod shows up to come and sort of take possession, they don't want to let him in the house. They're really rude to him. And they actually, without including Bushrod, they don't even sell the clothes. They get into a room together and divvy up all of George and Martha's clothes. And so you see George's regimentals on the upper left here. This is not actually a set that I think he never wore this into battle. I believe this was made during the Quasi-War when he was, offered a command. And this is now at the American History Museum. And that went to Eliza and her husband. We don't actually have a record of who got what. We just sort of can see the clothes turning up in various places. There's things like a fire screen at Tudor Place, Patty Peters' house, that's made out of Martha Washington's dresses. Nelly made like purses out of different fabric from Martha's dresses. So we see the clothes showing up at various points. Eliza also does something rather interesting with a pair of velvet breeches of George Washington's. If you look at this letter here, and you see this little black square at the bottom, that is a piece of black velvet from George Washington's breeches. The other thing here, it's very hard to see, is there's a word cut out in George Washington's handwriting from a Washington letter. Eliza would send these little relics in letters to people and say, remember George Washington by these. She would often also say, and remember her who was his best loved child. She said it enough that family friend Elizabeth Powell referred to her in a letter back to her as, I know you were his best loved child, but we know it was Nelly. It was not Eliza. It was definitely Nelly if he had a favorite. But so Eliza's doing this, especially putting herself into it when she does, as sort of a way of cementing her place in the Washington legacy. This is how she can do it. She has the objects, and if she cuts up a pair of breeches, she can distribute that to a lot more people than keeping them intact. And I have a picture in the book because we still have the breeches that she cut this out of. They're at Mount Vernon, and they have a big hole in them. So we know what this fabric is from. I mean, she even sends, we have record now from a site in Poland. She sent a letter just like this to a Polish princess. She's sending this to a lot of people. Some other objects here to note. Martha actually had Nelly inherit most of the china, but there was other china, other porcelainware that the children purchased at the sale. It was tradition also for the son to get silver plate pieces with the family crest. So Wash Custis gets most of that. Wash spends a ton of money at these sales. He doesn't have a house yet, so he has to stash things in a cabin when he first gets them. And one of the things that he purchases that is clearly not for use in the house is the camp tent. There's really actually 3 separate camp tents, and they're now 3 separate museums. You're seeing the one at the Museum of the American Revolution here. And he would set this up regularly. Again, reminding you, he'd give a speech under it about George Washington's heroism in the Revolution. He'd have a painting of George Washington hanging right behind him, giving this speech in this tent at events. He did this at yearly sheep shearings at Arlington House in order to raise awareness about domestic manufacture of wool. But this tent got sent all over the place over the years. It's amazing that it's still intact. In the center here, you see a miniature of George Washington that's owned by Tudor Place. And this was given to Patty Peter at her request by George Washington when she got married. And then next to that, you see another Smithsonian object. This is called the farewell address lamp. It is supposedly, according to Nelly, the lamp by which George Washington wrote the farewell address. Whether that is true or not, her description of where he's sitting and writing it, where she saw this light, would suggest that this was in Philadelphia. She was not in Philadelphia while he was writing it. The timing doesn't really line up, but it is known as the farewell address lamp. And you can see some other objects here, Martha Washington's writing desk. And if you notice here, this one small, I don't want the zoom stuff to pop up, this one small object here, which came into into Mount Vernon's collection as a warming pan. And when they sent it for conservation, they were told that is a bedpan. And I actually wrote an article for Smithsonian Magazine Online on, why would that be saved? Because in fact, at Tudor Place, at a certain point, they cataloged every Washington relic that they had, there were 500 or 600, put little number tags on them and created an inventory down to a bar of soap that they had that had supposedly been George Washington's. Because at the point that they are buying this stuff at the sale in 1802, they're setting up their own households. Patty Peter was having children. She would be stuck lying in bed during the lying in period of several months after having a baby and was probably using this bedpan. So these were both relics and objects that people used on a daily basis. Again, something like the trunk would be useful for storage, but it also is a relic with that George Washington connection. So the Custises are able to use these objects and really turn their houses into sort of museums of George Washington. Just to remind you where all of their houses are. So Tudor Place, Patty Peters' house in Georgetown. Supposedly at the time, they could like wave a flag out the window at Tudor Place and you could see it at Arlington House. You can't see Tudor Place from Arlington House now. There's trees in the way, but apparently you could then. And then Hoxton House is the main building at the Episcopal High School. I was actually just there visiting, meeting students 2 days ago because Eliza lived very briefly in this house. For most of her life, she's wandering between different houses. She's only there for 4 years. But this is the one sort of, there's another privately owned home called the Honeymoon House on the Southwest waterfront that we can also tie to Eliza. And then finally Woodlawn, which George Washington split off of the Mount Vernon plantation to give to Nelly and her husband, Lawrence Lewis. So yes, people were taking pilgrimages to Mount Vernon, but if they wanted to see the actual stuff, touch things that George Washington had touched, and hear stories about what George Washington was like in his lifetime, they had to go to the Custises' houses. I mean, Bushrod didn't even really have a lot of stories. He described himself as being slightly afraid of his uncle. He was not close with him emotionally. So it was the Custises who really became the keepers of the Washington legacy. And they sort of made their careers out of promoting it. So I want to spend some time just telling you about each of these people. Eliza, the eldest one, is born in 1776. I think this portrait by Gilbert Stuart tells you a lot of what you need to know about her. This is not a usual pose even for a man in a portrait. And the gaze that we're getting to is sort of a strong, defiant gaze. The original of this portrait is in private hands, but it is currently on display at Mount Vernon. So although the replica they have is very good as well. And from the time she was born, she was apparently quite spirited. This top quote, her father described her at birth as a strapping hussy or hussy. She was definitely strong-willed from a young age. We know that she complained to her stepfather saying, "Why can't I have the same education as a boy? I should be able to learn the same things." And it was partially the fact that she really chafed at the boundaries of womanhood that invited criticism of her. Before I get to that, just to mention her marriage. So a year after this portrait is painted, which I believe, we don't have a firm date, but I'm pretty sure this is 1795. In 96, she marries a man named Thomas Law, also known as an eccentric. He was 20 years her senior. He had been living in India as a colonial official. And he moved to the United States basically as a real estate investor. He wanted to speculate in land in the new nation's capital. He also brought with him sons born of an Indian woman who we really don't know a lot about, but he brought these mixed race children with him. And George does not seem to have been thrilled about this marriage. He pretty much says, if this is the guy you want to marry, go ahead, but you should really have a prenup. And in fact, they did have a prenup. You can find, it wasn't called that back then, but it's basically a marriage settlement that would give her and her male relatives some control over her wealth, even after she married, so that it wouldn't automatically go to her husband. And all of the girls inherited 60 enslaved people from the Tidewater estates when they married. And then they got another 40 people from Mount Vernon. after Martha died. So she never, even at Hoxton House, there's only a record of 6 or 7 people. We don't really know what she does with all of these enslaved people. Presumably, she's hiring them out to her brother and they're staying on those Tidewater estates. She probably hired some of them out to her stepfather as well. Where she really comes into controversy is when she and Thomas Law separate after 8 years of marriage. It's not entirely clear what happens that breaks up their marriage. They were both very strong-willed people who, a lot of the explanations of what happened was they just couldn't get along. He may have also brought a mistress back with him from an extended trip to Europe, but that would not have been grounds for separation at that time. So it is a scandal in DC. Everybody is talking about the separation. And that's the point where she says, I want to have my own farm. And she goes and buys that farm that becomes Episcopal High School campus. So it is for those reasons, and also the fact that she's very politically engaged. While she was living in DC, all of the senators and congressmen stopped by her house all the time. She was very good friends with Aaron Burr, for instance. She is the one Democratic Republican in the family. She's good friends with Dolly and James Madison. She expresses strong political opinions, saying things like, oh, you should tell the Secretary of War that they should put this fort here because strategically this would be a good location. She has an outfit made that is buff and blue, like Continental Army uniform, and has a feather in her hat and rides on horseback practicing archery through the city. There are 2 different people who call her an Amazon. And this comment from both these bottom comments are from her aunt Rosalie, who's actually her contemporary. She is certainly very eccentric and I think a little crazy. Multiple people called her crazy. I don't think she was crazy. I think she was unwilling to live within the bounds of proper womanhood at the time, and she was melodramatic. And I honestly think that the best assessment here is Rosalie's other comment. She is a woman who combines several faults with some brilliant qualities. Then we have her sister, Patty. Unfortunately, we don't have any portraits of Patty as a young adult. The only other image we have of Patty is when she is an elderly woman, and it's a photograph. And Eliza said that Patty was the favorite of her mother's family. She was supposed to be a very good-natured person. But again, their Aunt Rosalie found her to be a bit of a snob. And I think it seems that plenty of people did. So saying she has such a high opinion of herself, Rosalie went on to say she's basically not great to be around because of that. She was also such a high Federalist that she was basically pro-British during the War of 1812. After the British burned Washington, she named her daughter Britannia Wellington. And that Wellington is because she had met Wellington's troops who burned the city, and she liked them. And there's a very funny assessment of her. I'm going to read the second part of the quote from the book. Her niece said, after she died, "We have good reason to believe she went to heaven, for everyone has faults, and we cannot expect her to be more perfect than the rest of mankind." So that was from one of her nieces. We can imagine she was a difficult person in certain ways. She tried to prevent all of her kids from marrying people of their choice, only worked with one of them. So had difficult family relationships and lived at Tudor Place for all of her life. She did, unlike Eliza and Nelly, though, have a very good marriage to Thomas Peter. Here we have Nelly, who is probably the best known of the girls. She was obviously the most famous during the presidency. She was widely admired, both for her beauty and charm and her skills. She was quite smart. She had the best teachers, dance masters, drawing masters that you could have in the country at this point. And again, the niece said she was so kind and winning, no one could help loving her. No one, I would say, perhaps no one in the family, because as we'll see, there are plenty of people that may not have loved her. She also was witty and had a sense of humor. And when she wrote a sort of autobiography in 1798, she called herself a good sort of good-for-nothing somebody. She also had said she was determined to remain a spinster, As it turned out, she fell in love with and married Lawrence Lewis, Washington's nephew, who had come to live at Mount Vernon to sort of work as a secretary. I do think she fell in love with him, but it did not turn out to be a happy marriage. They had 8 children, and she outlived 7 of them. So she had a pretty difficult life. And you can see her getting more bitter as the years go on. And you especially see this when it comes to slavery. She again owned around 100 enslaved people. They were at Woodlawn. Some of them were at another farm at Audley that was in Clark County. And after the Nat Turner Rebellion happened in 1831, where there's an attempted slave rebellion in Virginia, she wrote a letter to the mayor of Boston and said, this is the fault of white people from the North. And if white people do not stop causing trouble in the South, we will have to exterminate Black people. So then she said this, she used the word exterminate in that letter twice. So that gives us a different side of Nelly. I think it's impossible to think of her the same way when we know that she said this. She only ever freed one enslaved person in her entire life, and that was one person that was freed in her will. And then we have Wash. Many of you may have heard Charlie Clark's talk about George Washington Parke Custis or read his new book on Wash, who was quite a figure. He was a lot like his father in that he did not do well in school, really frustrated George Washington with that. Washington said he had an almost unconquerable disposition to indolence. I was talking to a group of college students who had read the book, and they said, don't you think Jackie and Wash had ADD? Like, don't you think that was the problem? Who knows? We can't diagnose that kind of thing. But part of what his tutors were saying is that he couldn't remember things that he learned from one day to another. So part of it is he didn't need to go into any kind of profession or have this education other than to be a gentleman because he was inheriting so much wealth. And his tutor, Tobias Lear, said, the fact that he is so hampered by especially Martha and by all the enslaved people waiting on him is going to make him, I think the word he used was insufferable. And there was a lot of discussion over whether Martha Washington was too indulgent. Grandparents were often accused of that at the time. So how much of that is just a stereotype? And then how much of it is she really is indulging him too much? And this is part of why he never really has much self-discipline. He at least does not drop out of college to get married, although he does drop out of 2 different schools. And he lives at what is now Arlington House Plantation. He basically makes a career out of talking about George Washington's legacy. Through multiple media, he gives speeches, sometimes at political events. He's a Federalist, and so it's going to be at Federalist events in his younger years. He also writes plays. The plays were probably his most successful. At least he makes a decent amount of money on some of these plays. He had some of the earliest Indian plays, one of the first plays in America to have a Black Sambo character. He had a play with Jumping Jim Crow originator in it as well. So some rather unsavory dynamics to those plays. And then he also painted these massive canvases of scenes in the American Revolution with George Washington in them. He really saw himself as a serious artist. Unfortunately, other people did not agree. You see this quote, when it comes to his speeches, there were a lot of people who praised his speeches. Other people made fun of him. So this quote, that ridiculous creature, comes from somebody talking about, oh, he's giving another speech. When one of his paintings was on display at the US Capitol building, there was basically a newspaper column trashing it, saying how bad it was. And so he had somebody go pick up the painting and he told the person, just throw it in the Potomac on your way back home. I don't think that actually happened. I don't think it was thrown away. We do have some surviving paintings. He was really well loved by his one white surviving daughter and his grandchildren. His granddaughter said so kind he was, so indulgent. He really adored the grandchildren. The other side to Wash here is that we believe that he had somewhere around a dozen children by enslaved women. That is something that Arlington House has been spending a lot of time working with descendants on, both white and Black descendants, and including in their interpretation now. And the best known of those descendants was Mariah Syphax, to whom he gave 17 acres of land. And so that was Mary Custis Lee's half-sister. The fact that he was having children by sexually exploiting enslaved women may not have been unusual, though. We know, even within his family, we know this happened a fair amount in the South. Patty Peter had a son who also fathered children by an enslaved woman, and we have the possible fifth Custis sibling, William Costin. It is quite possible, if not probable, that William Costin was the son of Jackie Custis and an enslaved woman named Anne or Nancy Holmes. He was born in 1780. There's a whole sort of web of evidence that I've marshaled here in the book, and that I can talk about in questions if you're interested, as to why we believe that this is Jackie's son. He does stay in touch with the Custises their entire life. He becomes a porter for the Bank of Washington, which is depicted in the background of this image. And he is a highly respected citizen of DC. He also files basically a civil rights lawsuit in DC over one of the new Black laws that were passed while he was living there. And so he is sort of a different side here of the Custis family. We do know, though, from more recent research, that he was born into slavery. It appears that he, his mother, and his siblings were inherited by Eliza as part of her dowry right after Martha died. And then I think the timing is interesting, is when she and Thomas Law freed him, his mother and siblings. And she would later free his wife, Delphi Judge, and their children. So his whole family became freed and became fairly prosperous in Washington. We're still finding out more about this part of the story, though. And if you look at the family tree in the book, this is the last page of the family tree. We really struggled over how on these little pages that can't fold out to depict the messiness of a family tree that has children fathered by white men through likely sexually exploitative relationships with Black women whom they own. And it is possible that we may find more details, that some of these details may turn out to be wrong. We often find, we've skipped a generation somewhere. That may be the case with Carolyn Branham. It may be that he had children by a daughter of hers and we're missing a generation. But we do have people from the time period telling us that Carolyn Branham was the mother of some of these children. So when it comes to the family tree of Washington and the Custises, I would say that we still have more to learn. And just a hint of how this story wraps up, as you may know, Wash's daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee, marries Robert E. Lee in 1831. And I argue in the book that it is in large part, Lee's decision to fight for the Confederacy that brings this family back out of the spotlight, out of public favor, and is part of why we have very little knowledge about them today. They sort of lost their place as Washington's family because of Lee's decision in part. So what can we sort of take away here? First of all, I hope that readers of this book can come away understanding George and Martha Washington as parents, and not just understanding George as this stern presidential figure who's made out of marble, but seeing him and this other dimension of him. I think also when we look at the Custises, we see a family that spans from the Revolution to the Civil War. And that is a time in this country where a lot of the founders' ideals kind of fail. Americans cannot live up to them. And that is how we get to a civil war. That there's this struggle to keep up those ideals and never quite reaching them. And I think the Custises are really emblematic of that. And then the last thing, as I mentioned from the beginning, is this question of how we define family. I think a lot of us focus now on DNA. And you see those ancestry.com commercials that, say you're going to discover your identity through your DNA. But I also think now more than ever that our families are based on people that we choose to spend our time with, that we have been raised with, whether we are blood related to them or not, that there are many different configurations of family that might not show up neatly on a family tree or on a DNA test. And in fact, there is a new Society of Presidential Descendants. The Custises would not be eligible, their descendants today are not eligible to be members of that society because they were not blood related to George Washington. So I think that sort of tells us something about the degree to which those old notions of blood related family still drive things. So I'll just close by giving you, if you want to follow me, and I post on these different platforms, no longer the dumpster fire that is X or Twitter, but all these other places. I personally like Mastodon, but we have not gotten a lot of historians move over there. I will tell you, there's been a huge mass exodus of historians to the platform Blue Sky in the last month. But Instagram, you don't need a code to get onto Instagram. And my website as well has updates. So I am happy to take questions now. Up, Charlie. Oh,
well, I enjoyed the talk very much. I was wondering if you could talk about whether Arlington House and Mount Vernon talk to each other much. They seem to be very different cultures in my experience.
that is an interesting question. I was just, oh, for Zoom, yes. The question was, do Arlington House and Mount Vernon as institutions talk to each other? So there's also Woodlawn and Tudor Place too, right? And as somebody who did research in all these places, I often get field questions from different institutions, and they are more connected now than they were when I started this project. And I think that those connections, part of it, is when there's staff turnover, anytime somebody leaves, then that has to get rebuilt. And nobody stays in a job forever. But I think right now there's staff at each of those institutions that is really trying hard to coordinate with each other. And so there is more of that happening, especially, this research on slavery is hard to do. And all these institutions are doing it. And the more they can sort of combine their efforts, and also they're working with the same descendant group of people. And so, yes, they are working together at this point. Did you have a question there?
Could you talk about Tudor Place and who inherited Tudor Place?
So Tudor Place was actually built by Martha Custis Peter and her wife and her husband, Thomas Peter. Partially, there's been some discussion about this. It's always been thought it was with money she inherited from George Washington's will. That's the money question is a little unclear on that, but it does appear to be built with her money. It was designed by William Thornton, who also, as an architect, worked on the U.S. Capitol building. And then after she died, the house went to her daughter, Britannia. And it was in private hands until I think it only became a museum in the 1980s. I think that's right. So it has not been, it was carried on just through the family line, and then donated with much of the collection in it. Yes, if you want to see one of George Washington Parke Custis's paintings, last time I was at Arlington House, they had one on display in the house, and it's huge. It takes up the whole room. The others, I think you can see.
The Sonic Temple, George Washington, now and there's one at Woodlawn.
Small one at Woodlawn. Yeah, it's pretty small at Woodlawn. If you really want to see the big scale kind of thing that was up in the Capitol, I think you really have to go to Arlington to see that.
Carolyn Coram has raised a hand. Carolyn,
Okay.
can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi, I was going to ask a question about Nelly, because, that was troubling, of course, some of her comments and correspondence. But there's an interesting history at Woodlawn about what it evolved to be. And yeah, I can't quote sources, but I had understood that she, at some point after Washington died, that she freed her slaves, and it was partly based on Washington's model. And that was in the course of transitioning the plantation to more of a Quaker vision. And so it sounds like maybe that is not correct. And do you have any information to share on sort of how that evolved?
No, so Nelly
story?
definitely did not free people, but so the question was that this person had heard that Nelly Custis Lewis had freed her enslaved people and that there was a Quaker free colony set up at Woodlawn. There was a Quaker free colony set up at Woodlawn, but it was not with people enslaved by the Lewises. After Woodlawn was sold, it was sold to Quakers who set up that free Black community. And that is part of the interpretation at Woodlawn now. They're doing a lot of work overhauling their interpretation at Woodlawn right now. And so if you have not been to Woodlawn in a while, I encourage you to go take a tour. It's still evolving, but you'll hear new information that you wouldn't have heard before. And, there were former people who were formerly enslaved at Mount Vernon living in that area at the time too, who were sort of part of that community. Nellie and her husband, in fact, sent or sold 50 people to Louisiana. And then the rest of their people went with them to Audley in Clark County. There's been work going on with Woodlawn to locate those 50 people in Louisiana. Half of them went to the Daughters. We know the other half were sold to somebody who lived near the Daughters, all in Iberville Parish, which is where many of the people from Georgetown University were sold. We have a fair amount of information on them now, and there is work ongoing to find their descendants today. So there are descendants of people who were enslaved at Mount Vernon living in Louisiana. Probably a lot. All right, thank you.
We don't have any questions in chat, but Amy said that was a fascinating presentation. Many thanks for doing it.